If you're on a GLP-1 drug like Ozempic or Mounjaro, or you're thinking or curious about it, there are a few different narratives out there, and I wanted to get into all the aspects of the science today, especially the body composition data from very, very recent research. What happens when you stop taking these, the cardiovascular and inflammation findings beyond fat loss, and then a framework to keep your muscle while the drug does its thing. And then for those of you struggling with appetite and eating enough protein, stick around to the end. I'm going to share some tips for that. Welcome to Wits and Weights, the show that puts a popular piece of fitness advice under the microscope, finds the hidden reason it doesn't work, and gives you the deceptively simple fix that does. I'm your host, Philip Pape, and this episode was directly requested by two listeners, and I want to give them a shout out up front. Daryl T wrote in and said, I'm mainly wanting to know if it's safe to take GLP-1s and a deep dive into the long-term effects as well as its role in other indications beyond weight loss like inflammation and heart health. I'm also a nurse practitioner who's worked in urology for 11 years. So Daryl, we went back and forth a lot, and we're going to get into all of those things today. I know you can evaluate this stuff with clinical eyes. Obviously, I don't give medical advice, but I'm going to go deep on the evidence, and I think you're going to appreciate that. And then our listener, Brianna N, asked for, quote, a podcast about GLP-1 weight loss drugs and how to eat enough food and protein while taking them. And so, Brianna, this is definitely a gap, definitely a challenge that I've seen. The practical side of, well, I don't have as much of an appetite, which has seemed to be helpful for losing weight, but now it actually becomes a challenge when you're trying to get things like more protein or higher satiety foods. So we're going to cover that as well. And then stay tuned to the end for 3 specific high-protein meals that I think you could use that are under 300 calories, over 35 grams of protein. One of the challenges is protein density, and this will help, I think, when you don't have quite as much of an appetite. So in this episode, what are we covering? You're going to learn the actual lean mass loss percentages from the major GLP-1 trials. You're going to learn about how lifestyle modifies those, because really that's what it comes down to. So we're not fear-mongering. We're not going to say, oh, you just lose your muscle on these things. You're going to learn what happens to body composition, your heart, your inflammation when you take these drugs, and a practical 5-part framework to keep your muscle, whether you're currently on a GLP-1 or considering one, or honestly, or not, because the principles are universal. All right, so there are a couple narratives out on social media around GLP-1 drugs right now. And one narrative is, hey, these are really great. People have food noise. People are using them to lose a lot of weight that was affecting their health and had trouble getting started. We had guys like Jamie Selzer on the podcast where it's been, let's be honest, it's like a miracle drug. This is not something that's ever existed before. And yet he's doing it the right way by changing lifestyle at the same time. And that's where we get into some of the thorny things here. But that's the first kind of narrative. And often there's a pushback because people want to judge people for taking these and so on. I even did an episode a while back called Ozempic Envy about that phenomenon. And then the second narrative here is, hey, you lose all your muscle when you take these things, or it's cheating, or, hey, you're going to gain everything back the minute you stop. And you've probably seen some truths to all of this stuff in a way, not truths to judging people. I'm not talking about that, but really like what happens when you take these drugs. So just to say it up front, I'm definitely not anti-medication. I think if any tool is the right tool for your situation, use it. Use the tool if it helps. Obesity is pretty well established now as a medical condition that has actual physiological drivers, things like brain-related genes and many other things. It's very complicated. These drugs do work. Yes, there's a behavior and lifestyle component, but is one of many, many components. And the weight loss we've seen from these drugs is not only clinically meaningful, but just real life meaningful. Lots and lots of pounds lost. And we talk about it's not always about the scale, but it often is about the scale when you're carrying a lot of excess and dangerous body weight and body fat. The body composition side of that, meaning how much of your weight that you're losing comes from fat versus muscle, it's not a fixed thing. It's not like you have this side effect and it happens this way. It depends almost entirely on 2 things that you actually control. Number 1 is, do you lift weights? And number 2 is, do you eat enough I'll say enough protein, but there's other things you can have malnutrition with when you are in such a huge deficit that's often caused by these. But protein is kind of the leader of all of these. And so the difference between what I'll call unmitigated GLP-1 use and optimized GLP-1 use is the difference in what we're seeing with some of those numbers, like when you hear the 40% of your weight loss from lean mass versus, I've talked about it recently, losing close to zero from lean mass, just like if you weren't taking the drugs because you're doing the things. And that's a big gap between those two populations. And I guess the problem is today there's so many people taking these drugs that are then not doing the lifestyle thing that we hear about this more and more, and it gets fear-mongered and all that. So I want you to be strong. I want you to be metabolically strong and resilient. I want you to be leaner if that's what you want. I want you to be healthier, all of those things together. So that's what this episode is about. It's not whether you should take the drug. That's between you and your doctor and your goals. This is about what the evidence says you should do alongside the drug to get the best possible outcome. So let's start with numbers, because numbers always tell the nuance. They tell us the stuff, the reading between the lines of all these headlines. The STEP 1 trial, I've mentioned it several times. This is referenced a lot. It's foundational data on semaglutide, which is the drug behind Wegovy, and Ozempic. And in this study, it was on body composition. Participants lost about 15% of their weight over 68 weeks, and about 39 to 45% of that was lean mass. So just every 10 pounds you lost, about 4 were coming from muscle. Not something we want to do, right? We don't want to do that. And it sounds scary, but the context always matters. So we've talked about the quarter rule in body composition research, where we've seen for over decades of research, when anyone loses weight through any method, about a quarter of the weight loss on average is typically lean mass. And that's your physiology. Your body doesn't just say, I'm only going to burn fat. It's going to burn whatever it can. And I hate to use the word burn, but it's going to draw energy from wherever it can. And when we talk about muscle, it's not like eating away at your muscles. It's simply not rebuilding them. It's not preserving them. And that's kind of the way to think about it. So this percentage right off the bat is not great. And that affects anyone who's just not lifting weights. For semaglutide in STEP 1, the question in the STEP 1 trial, the question has always been recently, is it higher than the average? The answer is yes, but you also have to think about the rate of weight loss also is higher than average. So we're still teasing out the data. We're not 100% sure that there's an independent factor with these drugs, and it really doesn't matter because if you're doing the right thing, you don't have to worry about it. Now, if we look at tirzepatide, that's the drug behind Mounjaro and Zepbound. There was another study, the SURMOUNT-1 body composition sub-study, and that's February 2025. So you can look that one up. Participants lost 21% of their body weight, and lean mass accounted for about 25% of what was lost, which is more in line with other weight loss methods, and that held across different doses, different sexes, or both sexes, and all age groups. Now, we don't quite know what the difference is between the two. It may have to do with the tirzepatide being a dual receptor agonist, hitting both the GLP-1 and the GIP receptors, and maybe that gives some additional lean mass protection, but nothing is compared the two side by side. They're different studies, different potentially methodologies and populations and all that. Okay. Now, the lean mass includes more than skeletal muscle. I think we forget that in the discussion as well. It includes your organ mass, your connective tissue, your bone, and your water. And the fat tissue you have, what we call adipose tissue, believe it or not, is also 15 to 20% lean mass itself. I don't know if you realize that. It's something we don't talk very often, but there is some lean mass, quote unquote, in fat tissue, and that's water and protein in your fat cells. So when you lose a lot of body fat, you're automatically going to lose some measured lean mass, even if you haven't lost actual muscle. And now, of course, you're like, well, wait, one time I gained lean mass. Well, yes, if you gain enough muscle to offset that during a fat loss phase, like if you're a brand new lifter, that can offset it for sure. A very recent study, 2026, combined preclinical data with a human proof of concept trial and looked at lean tissue lost on semaglutide, and they found that liver mass decreased more than muscle mass. So that's an organ, right? So now we're saying, oh, maybe some of that lean mass loss is coming from organ mass loss. Interesting. And then there's a third piece here, and that's what we call muscle quality. So there was a SURPASS-3 MRI sub-study published last year, 2025. And it found that while muscle volume decreased on tirzepatide, intramuscular fat infiltration, now that's the fat marbled within the muscle itself, decreased significantly more than you would expect from weight loss alone. So now less fat inside the muscle means better muscle quality, insulin sensitivity, better function. And the researchers call these adaptive changes, not pathological, just adaptive changes. And finally, we had the Step Up trial, and that tested the new higher dose semaglutide of 7.2 milligrams, found the same pattern. And they used MRI instead of DEXA. They measured about 16% of weight loss coming from lean tissue, and then the muscle function, as they measured it with sit-to-stand testing, was preserved. I don't know what to make of that piece of it, honestly, because it's a low bar, but I guess it's important. But the summary is this, right? The initial numbers from the step 1, that's like the full-on unmitigated scenario. First study they did on this, or the first big study that I guess we can rely on. And really, in practicality, the lean mass fraction of the muscle lost ranges from anywhere from 0 to like 8% in people who do train and eat protein. Remember that some of that lean mass is good. It's from fat, what I should say, fat cells. And then some of it is non-muscle tissue anyway. And then some is all the way up to say 45% in people just don't do anything they're supposed to do. And they're losing tons of weight really fast. All right. So that is body composition. I think we're all caught up. Now we're going to shift to what Daryl was talking about, which is the non-weight loss indications. There was a trial back in 2023 called SELECT, over 17,000 adults that had heart disease, a high BMI over 27, but no diabetes. And semaglutide reduced their major cardiovascular events by about 20% with a hazard ratio of 0.8, and it reduced all-cause mortality by 19%. And I think, from what I can read, the cardiology community was a bit surprised because there was an analysis in the Lancet in 2025 that found only a third of the heart benefit was explained by the reduction in waste. In other words, they lost weight, they got a benefit to the heart, but there was more of a benefit than you would expect. And the cardiovascular protection seemed to be consistent regardless of how much weight people lost. And so it's not just, hey, lose weight, help your heart kind of thing. Something else must be going on. So same year, 2025, last year, for tirzepatide, the SURPASS-CVOT trial compared it to dulaglutide, which apparently already has proven heart benefits. And tirzepatide met what's called non-inferiority, meaning it's at least as good. And against a theoretical placebo, they estimated a reduction in major heart events by 28%. And 39% reduction in all-cause mortality. These are huge numbers. And then the inflammation data probably explains some of this cardiovascular data. It's all connected, right? So across the STEP trials, going back to those semaglutide trials, they found a reduction in C-reactive protein, CRP. That's a key inflammatory marker we can measure in our blood pretty easily. And it dropped by 38% over 2 years. It dropped 12% at just 4 weeks, and that's before there was any meaningful weight loss. They only lost like 2 to 3% of their body weight by that point. So that's really strong evidence for a direct anti-inflammatory effect that's independent of weight change. At least that's my understanding and reading of the evidence. Another review last year in the Journal of Clinical Investigation looked at a neural pathway where GLP-1 receptor activation in the brain reduces circulating TNF-alpha, and it does so just within a few hours. Just a few hours. This is before really anything else has changed. So that's pretty clear potential cause and effect going on. Now let's talk about the brain. And this is maybe a little bit less exciting than what we know so far. There's some large observational studies where GLP-1 users had 40 to 70% lower risk of developing Alzheimer's, and it generated a lot of headlines at the time. But then when Novo Nordisk tested oral semaglutide directly in people who already had mild cognitive impairment or early Alzheimer's in the EVOKE and EVOKE Plus trials, it failed to make a difference versus placebo on things like cognitive scores. And there was another trial of liraglutide in Alzheimer's, that also didn't seem to have an impact, but it did show 18% slower cognitive decline, and it preserved brain volume on MRI. There was another study that showed no benefit for Parkinson. So, things are being tested out. Who knows where we're going to end up with all this? I'm not claiming anything here. I'm just sharing what seems to be known so far from whatever studies have been done. And I guess the emerging interpretation here, and for Daryl, our listener who asked about those things, I think it's that GLP-1 drugs may help prevent some neurodegeneration through anti-inflammatory metabolic effects. They may not treat the disease, maybe a prevention thing. And honestly, again, I'm not giving you medical advice here. This is just my reading of evidence as a layperson when it comes to this stuff. So I hope that's helpful and at least gives you a thought to look into some of these things. So we've just covered why body composition on GLP-1 drugs it's not a fixed static thing. It highly depends on your training, your protein intake. And if you're thinking, okay, how do I actually set up my protein? How do I structure my training? How do I know if I'm losing weight too fast or if my plan is working? That is what Eat More, Lift Heavy is built for. This is my 26-week coach program. I created it in conjunction with Coach Carol. So you get 2 coaches. And it's a 3 phases over 26 weeks where phase 1 is where we get your tracking and your baseline dialed in. Phase 2 is where most of the, I'll say, coaching happens, because now you have data that you can read and make decisions from for your protein, your progression, your hunger signals. If you're on GLP-1s, are you losing weight too fast or just right? Are you holding onto your muscle? How are you training the right way? And if you're on a GLP-1, I think it's fantastic. These are the same skills we want to build. And if anything, you really want to come in and learn those skills. So eventually you could potentially titrate off the drugs. And whether or not you do that, you can live with them in a more sustainable way. So there's a lot in there. I'm not going to go over all the things. You've got calls, you've got 1 focus per week. We've got a community. We've got all that fun stuff. But the key is that you're going to build skills 1 week at a time so that you come out more confident on the other side. EatMoreLiftHeavy.com. That's EatMoreLiftHeavy.com. Link is in the show notes as well. All right. So the next question people often ask is, what happens when you get off these drugs? Speaking of stopping, what happens when you stop? And again, we go back to the step 1. They had an extension study where at the end of it, after 68 weeks on semaglutide, participants lost about 17% of their body weight. And then when they stopped the drug, a year later, they'd regained 2/3 of the weight they lost. And also the cardiometabolic improvements in their blood pressure, their lipids, their blood sugar, those all reverted toward baseline too, which kind of makes sense. Obviously, if you're gaining weight and you're not getting the protective effects, if these drugs have independent effects, you'd be expected to happen. For tirzepatide, the SURMOUNT-4 trial had a similar outcome. 70% regained their weight within a year of stopping. And 82% of patients who stopped regained at least a quarter of the weight within 12 months. And then we have a 2025 meta-analysis across 11 different trials that found an average regain of about 5.6 kilograms, which if I do the math in my head is something like 12 pounds or something, multiplied by 2.2. And then even longer follow-up periods showed even larger regain of weight. Now, that sounds discouraging, but I'm all about reframing and understanding the context. So think of it this way. No one would take blood pressure medication for a year and then stop and be surprised when their blood pressure went up if they didn't do anything else, especially. That's the nature of a chronic condition. The drug was managing a physiological drive inside your body. You remove the drug and the drive returns. So GLP-1 drugs do the same thing at a minimum with your appetite, let alone with these other metabolic things we're talking about. Your body has this biologically defended set point. Now, I'm hot and cold on like set point theory, but when you've been doing something for a long time, many years, there does seem to be a reversion to the mean that your body wants to do in terms of your weight and your habits and everything else. And the drugs are suppressing the appetite signals that would have caused you to eat up to that point and then some. And so when you remove the drug, those signals come back, right? And we talked to Jamie Selzer on this podcast. He was talking about being on this for life in his case. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the case for everyone. It depends on the person. But the promising thing here is other research. There was a Copenhagen trial published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2021, and it showed that exercise actually changes this equation. So patients who exercise on liraglutide regained 5 kilograms less than those who just used the drug after a full year after the treatment stopped. And they were 7 times more likely to maintain at least 10% weight loss. And it increased the body's own natural GLP-1 production. So exercise during taking the drugs, it's not just I'll say transient support. It's actually giving you long-term benefits, which really isn't that surprising, is it? And now they say exercise. I like to be specific. Strength training, walking, all the types of activity we talk about on this show, especially lifting weights, as being a huge game changer for the longer term. But when you stop a GLP-1, you are probably going to gain some initial weight anyway, like anyone would when you start to eat more. Your body restores glycogen. That's the stored carbs in your muscle and liver. Glycogen binds with water. So the first 3 to 5 pounds on the scale on average are not body fat. And that's always something when I tell people they're going to gain weight, if they come out of a deficit and go to maintenance, is what's going to happen. So you got to account for that as well. And don't blame it on the drugs. Okay, so where are we now? We've covered body composition data, cardiovascular and inflammatory story regarding the drugs, and the weight regain piece. Now, how can you use this data? So if you're on or considering a GLP-1 drug, there's 5 things the evidence says you should prioritize. And the cool thing is, these are the same things this show, Wits and Weights, has always taught. So this is a great refresher if you've already heard it, and it's a great new sense of empowerment and information that you can use if it's new to you. Because the drug is not going to change the principles. What I would say is it amplifies the consequences of ignoring these principles. That makes sense. Okay. So number 1 is the protein. We've got to have a certain amount of protein. I'm just going to say the number again, at least 0.7 grams per pound, or 1.2 grams or 1.6 grams per kilogram. Some numbers you see out there advise less, but we're talking about lifting weights here and having enough, and we're talking about older population, maybe over 40. I would just say going for 30 or more grams of protein for every meal so that it adds up to around 0.7 grams per pound of your body weight or more is solid. And if you don't have an appetite, which is going to be the case, that's where you have to prioritize protein-dense, low-volume foods, where we normally talk about the opposite for most people, trying to have higher volume foods, but this is where you need it to be more dense. And I'm going to give you 3 specific meals at the end of this episode that do exactly that, so I want you to stick around. But I want to get through these principles first because these are important to have before you go to tactics. So number 2 is resistance training, non-negotiable. This is the most evidence-supported intervention to preserve lean mass, period, let alone on GLP-1 drugs. And we talked about the exercise group in the Copenhagen trial. There's also a case series in 2025 of patients who did resistance training while on semaglutide or tirzepatide. And I talked about this in a previous episode. The amount of lean tissue they lost was low. It was something like 5 to 10%. It's very similar to anybody who would lose weight and hold on to muscle, remembering that some of that lean mass is not muscle. And so your actual muscle loss is quite small. And if you're doing it right, it kind of comes right back when you get back to maintenance or start building again. So all you need at a minimum is 2 to 3 sessions per week, hitting all major muscle groups with progressive overload. So if you want further numbers than that, I would say try to hit major muscle groups for around 10 sets per muscle group per week. And that could be direct or indirect. That leads to a whole other discussion and many other podcast episodes about training and programming. But heck, going from 0 to 1 a week is itself a massive game changer compared to saying, no, I just can't do this and I'm not going to train. You've got to lift weights. All right, number 3 is monitoring your rate of loss. So the GLP-1 drugs, because they suppress your appetite by a lot, like 30 to 40%, it can push you into a very aggressive deficit without even trying. I see it all the time. Clients come in or members come in to eat more, lift heavy, and it's ironic because the eat more in their mind is because they're actually not able to eat more due to the appetite while losing weight. It's a very interesting place to be. And so if your scale is dropping faster than 1% of your body weight per week, you are definitely in that zone where the lean mass loss can accelerate. All right. There's a lot of other variables behind it, like how much weight do you have to lose and how lean are you to begin with, et cetera. But the fix here is just to intentionally eat more, starting with protein. Don't be all excited about this rapid weight loss. Like, manage it and get control of it. And this may also let you reduce your dosage of the drug, which I don't know if it's going to save you money as well, maybe reduce side effects, those kinds of things. Number 4 is to start early. Now, what do I mean by this? There was a study in 2026, Semaline, it was called. It found that lean mass loss was largest in the first 3 to 6 months, and then it stabilized. And they used hand grip strength and found that it improved. And sarcopenic obesity, so sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle and function, actually reduced as well. Like there was less of it, from 49 to 33%. But the loss of lean mass is really front loaded. So ideally, you're starting your training and protein optimization when you start the medication. But if you haven't, the next best time to start is now, right? That's obviously always the case. Don't use that as an excuse. Then number 5 is plan ahead for an off-ramp. Now, a lot of people aren't doing this. A lot of you taking these drugs, I know it because I talk to you, you're just taking them. You're kind of in the middle and you're like, all right, I'm just going to keep taking them. Well, if you plan to eventually stop or want to reduce the dose, right? And many people do, some people don't. And it's okay to experiment and try coming off, seeing what happens. And maybe you do have to go back on. That's fine. The behavioral habits that you build while on the drug, that is the thing, that's the buffer. That's like the insurance policy that will save you later on when you reduce or come off of these. And at a minimum, they'll get rid of some variables that you need to fix anyway, right? Your training and your nutrition, so that you can isolate whatever remains in terms of things like food noise or appetite. So this would be, how do you structure a meal? Do you plan ahead? What are your training habits? Do you get enough protein? All those things, the things that we teach in Eat More, Lift Heavy, exactly those skills. And then for those who are staying on these drugs long-term, which is a totally valid option, and some people are probably going to have to do this, there is now an oral pill for semaglutide that they're starting to study, and I guess it's pretty affordable as well. There's a higher dose injectable semaglutide, and there are more options now than ever is what I'm saying. So meaning you should kind of shop around and always be aware of what's available. Talk to your doctor, of course. This is not me giving you medical advice. This is just be aware of the options as they continue to evolve and change. You might find something that has less side effects or a lower dose or something like that, or it's more convenient to take, etc. All right, last little thing here is, I think Daryl asked about safety as well, and this is where I could easily get into the medical side of things too much more than I'm comfortable with. But if you look up the studies, large cohort studies done as recently as 2026, meta-analysis done as recently as 2025 on thyroid cancer, on pancreatitis, on gastroparesis, on even things like suicidal ideation. There's a lot of mixed data. Generally, it seems like some things are getting overblown. You know, there have been these like what they call like black box warnings that were on and then they were removed from the labels. There's weird conditions like dysesthesia. I don't even know how to pronounce it. It's like an altered skin sensation. So there's all these really weird little side effects and things. And in studies that show some sort of risk increase for like a cancer, oftentimes they're confounded by other things like gallstone formation or the fact that you're losing weight rapidly, all that kind of stuff. So I really don't want to make any claims or even get into that data here today. I'll leave that for more of the medical podcasts, but it's very interesting if you are taking them or thinking about taking them just to be educated on things like side effects and long-term effects, if you're able to tease that out, which is very difficult, I realize. All right, before we wrap up, remember those 3 high-protein meals that I promised you, each under 300 calories, over 35 grams of protein. If you don't have an appetite, I'm going to share those in just a second. But if you know someone who's currently on a GLP-1 med, or thinking about starting one, or curious about them, or talking about them, send them this episode. Please share this episode. We love to spread the word and get people educated and excited and curious. Text them a link from your app, whatever's the easiest way to do it, because I doubt they're getting a lot of this information from their healthcare professional. I'm just saying, I doubt they are. The odds are low from what I've discovered. And things like protein and training and whatnot, doctors generally are just not talking about those from a prescriptive standpoint, because that's not really their job anyway. So text this friend who needs to know, wants to know, who you love and want them to know about it. All right, here are some ideas for hitting a lot of protein in a very dense way without having as much volume. So meal 1 is take a cup of non-fat Greek yogurt, a scoop of whey protein, handful of berries. I've mentioned this before. This is like the perfect combination of low calorie, it's like 280 calories, 42 grams of protein. And of course, you got the fiber in the berries and it tastes great. You could add some cinnamon, add some sweetener in there, you know, either a calorie sweetener, which adds calories, or if you're okay with an artificial sweetener like a stevia. All right, meal 2, let's go with the chicken breast. About 4 ounces of chicken breast mixed with a tablespoon of mayo and squeeze a lemon on a bed of spinach. So that's kind of like your chicken salad, if you will. And of course, you could put that on like high fiber wrap or something like that if you want to add more fiber and maybe even a little protein that way. So we're talking 250 to 300 calories and almost 40 grams of protein. Super quick and easy, convenient. And you could even use canned chicken. And then meal number 3 is a protein shake where you've got 1.5 to 2 scoops of whey. You use something like skim milk or almond milk and some peanut butter powder if you like peanut butter so you don't get all the extra calories and fat from actual peanut butter. So again, that is about 290 calories, 43 grams of protein. Just super simple, convenient ideas. 3 meals, protein forward. They're low volume. That's the key. They're low volume. They shouldn't make you as full, and you can rotate them through and get your protein. All right, until next time, keep using your wits, lifting those weights, and remember that these GLP-1 drugs, they definitely can affect your appetite, but regardless of whether you're on them or not, it's the protein and the training and the lifestyle that are really going to make the difference for you in the long term. I'm Philip Pape, and I'll talk to you next time here on the Wits and Weights podcast. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Please consult your healthcare provider before making any health changes. Some links mentioned may be affiliate links, which means I may earn a commission at no extra cost to you if you choose to purchase.